Hey gang, this is Anthony Williams again with another episode of our Wealth Preservation Asset Protection series. I'm super excited about this morning. We've got Jay Mooreland. He's with the Behavioral Finance Network. And I actually had the privilege of meeting with Jay, I think it was now about a year ago, at an industry conference. And it was really resonating with me because in my industry, we are routinely beat over the head with all the financial news and the folks who go on Google and watch the news, and then they come back to us and they say, this is what my plan is supposed to be, or what are my returns, and should I buy, should I sell, what stock, all these types of things. And Jay's messaging was really appealing to me because it took a step back from the data, it took a step back from the analytics in terms of investing numbers, and it said, how do we really make decisions? How are we influenced, and how can we, if we're aware of those things, actually impact better decision making really as it goes. And so Jay, if you wouldn't mind, again, thank you so much for being here today. If you wouldn't mind just kind of sharing a little bit about you, your background, how you got into this, like why it was important, and then, obviously we'll just kind of a conversation here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been in the finance industry since '99 as a financial advisor like yourself. And then in the financial crisis, so we're talking 2009 here, I was really blown by that. Like all the experts totally missed it, right? It's interesting that the experts come out and they say, hey, GDP will go up, 2.2% this year, or 2.1 or 1.8. It's like, who really cares? I mean, what we need experts for are for the big blowups, right? And of course, they weren't there. Now, hindsight's 2020, but it got me thinking, what is the whole purpose of these experts? And I thought about it, and I thought, imagine when Bear Stearns went under, because they went under about a year before, I think it was, the whole system collapsed. Ben Bernanke, who was the Fed chief at that time, came out and said, he said, oh, Bear, that's subprime. That's a subprime issue. Don't worry about it. Imagine if he actually knew it was going to happen and he came out and said, hey, guys, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Right? He couldn't say that, right? So I realized, I'm like, okay, Wall Street needs to be optimistically biased to prevent kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy happening, that if they thought something bad was going to happen, the very fact that they would say that would cause, a huge sell-off. So I actually went back to school, got a master's degree in applied economics because I wanted to learn what economists and these experts did so I could make an unbiased opinion that would not move the markets, right? I could do it for myself and clients and so forth. And in that study, during my thesis, I came across this topic of behavioral finance, or also known as behavioral economics, which is really about how we make decisions when we're dealing with uncertainty. And it was just mind-opening to me. So I've spent the last close to decade now working on solutions for advisors like yourself for the individual investor to help them filter out the noise and ultimately just make better, more deliberate, thoughtful decisions, despite all the temptations and feelings that are constantly bombarding us.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I suspect you're a Midwestern guy, I'm a Midwestern guy, and I'm sure that others have had this experience. I remember when I was a youngster and my parents saying, Anthony, garbage in, garbage out, and I feel like in the financial space, that couldn't be more apropos, right? You're sitting there watching. I mean, by example, my father calls me, this is going back, 4 to 6 weeks ago. Hey, Anthony, I saw this expert on Fox Business News or CNBC, one of those channels. And he said we should all go to cash. And my response to him, largely because some of the training that you've provided, and also frankly, a degree of common sense and experience, is Dad, turn off the news. Right. Just stop with those inputs because it's going to drive you nuts on the output side. And so, kind of just more personal anecdote, but understand how that works out. If we could pivot then, Jay, taking your expertise and thinking about retail investors specifically, what are some of the issues or the problems, the obstacles, the hiccups that you've experienced, and also what maybe we can do to understand that better or overcome some of those things?
I mean, it really comes down to how we're all hardwired. We're hardwired with a fantastic brain that's very efficient in everyday life. So our brain is constantly making mental shortcuts. Like we're barely analyzing anything. Our brain is a pattern detecting machine. A lot of the stuff works behind the scenes in our brain to make sure that we can function throughout the day. You know, if you've ever driven from point A to point B, and during that time you were thinking about work, family, maybe something else, and you get to your destination, you're like, I don't even remember making all those turns, right? I mean, that's what happens. There's so much that happens below the consciousness level of our brain, but that actually influences a lot of the decisions that we make. So I like to just sum it up as far as, look, we have mental shortcuts and we're subject to emotions. And those two combined, especially whenever we're facing heightened uncertainty or whenever we're a little bit anxious, like it's a really big decision or something like that, they can really flare up and cause us to make unwise decisions. You know, for the, and by the way, everybody's impacted by this. You know, and here's the thing, even experts, like, you know, I study it a lot, but there are people who have been studying this stuff for years and years, decades and decades. Everybody's subject to it. So education alone, or just knowing about this, does not stop it from happening because it's so automatic. Like afterwards, or maybe even during it, I can see that, okay, I'm like really emotional right now, but that doesn't mean I can stop the emotions. The only thing I can do is recognize I'm emotional and get out of that, right? So it's not like I can just turn on a dime. I've only gotten to the point to where I can recognize it and then try and get out of it. But even then, the lure and the pull is so natural that I'm still not 100% in getting out of it, right? I mean, we're all human. So one of the biggest errors that I have found for all investors, but specifically retail investors, that's you, that includes yourself, me, you know, everybody that's got money in the markets, is really our propensity to be influenced by the news. And this is, by the way, this isn't just financial, it's political, it's absolutely everything. But in our brain, what's really interesting is that our brain tends to put more emphasis on information that's most available to it. Meaning the things that we're hearing about a lot, and certainly most recently, they're on the forefront of the brain. That actually receives a lot of its attention. Why? Because it's on the forefront of the brain. It doesn't have to go diving back into our memories and our experiences to analyze something. It's that mental shortcut, right? It's right there, it's easy, it's accessible, which is why, tying in your prior example, is the media is actually one of the worst things for an investor to watch. In fact, I say over and over again that the financial media is the investor's worst enemy. And that's because their job is not to help investors retire or make good decisions. Absolutely not. Their job is not even to give the news. Their job is simply to get people to tune in. That's it. So at the end of every market day, you might turn on the media or go to a website, and let's say the market was up, and it'll give you a reason why the market was up. And it's, oh, the market is up because, you know, only, you know, so many people died of coronavirus. And then the very next day, the market will go down, and you'll look at it and you'll say, why did the market go down? Well, the market went down because X amount of people died of coronavirus. It's like, wait, this is the same data. It's like, exactly. You know, the reason the market goes up and down because there's more buyers one day than sellers. And that's largely driven by the mood and the expectation of investors that day, which is largely influenced by the news story of the day. So people may get frustrated with how volatile the markets are, but they're volatile because the news is constantly flip-flopping, because they're not trying to help us make good decisions. They're simply trying to get us to tune in. So what they do is they use fear. There's actually two sides to fear. Usually when we think of fear financially, we think of fear of loss. That's like the number one thing we think of. And they absolutely use that very, very well. But then they'll flip it on its side, and they'll call it, it's now fear of missing out. Other people call it greed. Greed is not a strong enough. Fear is one of the strongest influences we have. So it's one thing to be greedy, but it's another thing to have fear of missing out. And those are the two that cause us to want to buy and sell. And the more often we watch the news, the more often we're going to be tempted to do that back and forth and abandon what would have been a very logical and successful financial plan.
I mean, that's just terrific feedback. And it kind of makes me wonder, as both an investor and as an advisor, which maybe I'll just kind of tie this into the next question, is if we have advisors like you and me, and we're mindful of some of these emotional mental shortcuts, maybe some biases and so forth, what are the things advisors then need to be doing to assist folks because I would imagine if we're impacted by these mental shortcuts, the penchant for that to then trickle down to the clients and then get all wrapped up in the emotional hubbubaloo. I mean, look, I can't help but notice your backdrop is the coronavirus. And so I know you had it and so forth. And we've talked about that. But you figure the coronavirus, quarantining, the lockdown, staying at home. And now, of course, we have all these other social, civil considerations that are going on in the country. It just seems like a hotbed for bad decision making when we have all these external forces that are kind of going that fear route like you talked about. So you hit on investors. What about advisors? What about wealth strategists?
Yeah, you know, and that's a little bit difficult. First of all, I think it's really important to understand that just because somebody carries a title of advisor, wealth strategist, or even certified financial planner, it does not mean that they understand how the brain works. I mean, that's my job, right, Anthony? We work together, right? So there's only a very small subset that actually understand the psychology of decision making. That is so important. You know, most advisors will talk about a plan, which is very important. That is like the bedrock to everything. But here's the thing. A plan is actually really easy to create. Like, let's get out of the financial realm. Let's say you want to get fit. You want to lose some weight and you want to get a little bit trimmer. The plan is really easy to develop, right? You're going to figure out, okay, what am I going to eat that's going to be a little bit better? How am I going to improve my exercise? Because I know what I need to do to do it. But the problem, the biggest challenge is not the plan, it's the discipline to the plan. That's where it all falls off. So advisors really, like just like a retail investor needs to have a financial plan, the advisor needs to have a plan of how they're going to communicate with clients. Because you're right, man, we are not, we're not, it's not like we don't have these emotions or anything. In fact, one of the reasons I created the Behavioral Finance Network, and I do this, is because I find that I tend to be a much more emotional person than the average guy down the street. I just know that about myself. And even though I know it, it doesn't mean it's going to be any less. So I've created a network, I've created a system here where I'm coaching advisors, and that coaching, that sharing of that information, it helps me get in line. Like, it helps me stay rational. You know, it's kind of like, you know, people that really learn are the teachers. We don't really learn something until we teach it, right? And so that's what it is. So advisors, by understanding this stuff and then consistently sharing it with clients, it helps them. Number one, they have to, by the very nature, say, I'm not going to be a hypocrite. I'm going to get in line, right? And number two, hearing that and saying it, it actually helps you believe it. It gets you out of the emotions, and it helps kind of turn on that cognitive brain that we need turned back online so we can make better decisions. But there needs to be, whether you're an individual investor or a financial professional, you need to have some sort of plan or systematic approach to everything we do, because that way all you need to do is just focus on doing what you need to do and not allowing the emotion of the day to dictate, do I do this today or not? That's why good habits in all aspects of life are so important. If we have good habits, it's not a question of whether we feel like doing it on a certain day. It's simply a question of, nope, this is who I want to become, and this is the habit or the action I need to take to become that person. Therefore, I'm going to do it irrespective of how I feel. And sometimes, for going back to the prior question, the best thing to do is for investors, it's to turn off that TV. And so some people will say, wait a second, if I do that, I won't be informed. And you just got to ask yourself, but what is it informing you of? And how does that information negatively impact you? Not all information is good information.
You know, I like what you just said there, and whether you realize it or not, you just channeled your inner Jocko Willink. I don't know if you're familiar with Jocko's work, but he's a Navy SEAL. So I'm about to give you a nice ego boost here. And he has an expression which is discipline equals freedom. And he says, motivation is just like happiness. It's just like sadness. It's just like any other type of emotion. He goes, you can be all the motivated you want every single day, but if you don't have discipline to stick to the plan, to stick to the habits, to stick to the system, to stick to the process. And I think large part what a financial advisor does is provides that perspective and provides those friendly reminders. I mean, I know you had your coronavirus consideration. I happen to have been stuck on a cruise because of the coronavirus unnecessarily. And the phone calls, once I was able to get the upgraded internet, The phone calls that I was having with clients were largely, it was all emotion. It was, what should we do? I'm freaking out. Or can we be predatory? Like, how do we want to approach it? And I said, look, we have your plan. So let's just be confident in our plan. We had 2008, we had 2009. We've kind of been there before, right? Let's look over the long haul. Let's take a longer term perspective and stick to the plan. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't make some modifications, of course. We made some slight augmentations to not their plan as a whole, just the kind of the manner in which we were going to get there. But I always love that. Discipline equals freedom. And it applies in all of these areas. So if we could pivot then, if you think about maybe when we talk about discipline, we talk about habits. I'll use working out as an example. It could be running, it could be hitting the gym, resistance training. A friend of mine used to always say, he goes, in order to do push-ups, you got to do push-ups. If you want to bench a lot, you got to bench a lot. If you want to run far, you have to run a lot of miles, right? So I guess where I'm kind of going with this is, what can we do when we're faced with loss? What are some of the techniques or some of the, we hear a lot about this is, what's the pill we can take, Jay, to kind of help us manage some of those expectations, manage, I know you do a lot of work where you talk about various biases and how that can get into the muddling of the decision-making process. So when we're talking about this whole series, which is wealth preservation, asset protection, keeping your wealth, well, we can agree bad decision-making or poor decision-making drains potentially that wealth. So what are some of the things from your perspective that we all should be doing, or that we can practice to be better at delivering the messaging or making better decisions?
Yeah, so I'll give you two things. One is just a core perception. It's really an understanding we need to have about the concept of loss to begin with. Understand that whenever we're talking about financial loss, almost all loss, 99% of financial loss, is temporary loss. It's simple. You haven't lost anything. All that's happened is that the value today is a little bit less than the value it was yesterday, or maybe a lot less, right? I mean, who knows? But that's the idea, is that, people look at it and they're like, oh my gosh, I've lost this money. I've lost this money. It's like, hey, look, the market since day one has always fluctuated, and it will always fluctuate, meaning 99.9% of the time, you're not going to be hitting an all-time high. So you're going to be at a loss compared to something, that you like to call a temporary loss compared to something else. So we need to understand, even the crushing losses of 2008, 2009, where the markets went down roughly 48, 50%, depending upon where you were invested, that was all a temporary loss. How do I know that? Because the market came back and now we're at all-time highs. Okay, go back just a couple of months where we lost 35%. The fastest the market has ever lost 35%. We had it in 2020. Oh my gosh, I lost all this money. Hey, guess what? We basically recouped all of that. In a year-over-year basis, we're actually positive. So one thing is to understand is that loss, when it comes to financial markets, is temporary. The only and there's nothing, we shouldn't concern ourselves with temporary loss, because that is a natural side effect. I mean, it's just a natural occurrence of the markets. So we shouldn't be concerned about that. What we need to be concerned about is permanent loss. Permanent loss is when we lose something and we cannot get it back again. And financially speaking, the only time we exhibit permanent loss is when we sell during a temporary loss. When we sell during a temporary loss, when we go to cash, and it's usually because of emotions and we're afraid, we're throwing the towel, understand that at that point in time, you created a permanent loss. And at some point, that market's going to turn and you're not going to be in it. And Anthony's not going to know when it's going to happen. I'm not going to know when it's going to happen, right? So we have to understand the difference between temporary and permanent loss. And let me give you this analogy here, because nobody likes the feeling of loss. There's nobody I know that when they see their portfolio go down $100,000 is like, woohoo, I mean, we're just not doing that, right? So here's an analogy. If I don't like the feeling of punching myself in the face, what wise advice would you have for me? What would you say, Anthony?
Stop punching yourself in the face.
Stop punching myself in the face. So if I don't like that losses are happening, stop looking. Stop. I mean, there's no the holy grail is stop looking. If you stop looking, you won't notice. For example, let's say June 5th of last year. So that's last Friday as we're recording this. Let's say June 5th, you invested into the S&P 500. And then you never looked again until June 5th of this year. Let's say you didn't even know we had coronavirus. You didn't even know about the riots and all this. You didn't know about anything. And all you did, you went off to an island for a year. You came back, you looked at your portfolio. You're up 10%. You would never know it. And so understand that we cannot control the volatility and the fluctuations of the market, but we can control how much you feel because it is a function of how often you look. If you don't like it, something that's a natural part of the market, you only have two options. Number one, don't play in the market, which means you're not going to, most likely not going to reach your financial goals. Or number two, stop looking and trust the plan.
Jay, I think that's terrific advice. Permanent loss, temporary loss, the differentiation there, sticking to the plan, the discipline. And frankly, I can't think of a better place to wrap this interview up because that's just such valuable information. It's certainly not the kind of stuff you hear on CNBC or Fox Business News or any of that type of stuff, that we take a deep breath, we stop looking at all the garbage that's out there, and instead we focus on the things that we can control in our plan. So again, I want to thank you very much for your time today. Incredible insights. Wealth preservation, asset protection, it has many different facets. And we're going to hit a lot of these, but this is critical. So thank you very much, Jay, for your time.
Absolutely. Good seeing you again, Anthony.
Likewise.